Okay, welcome again, and thanks for joining. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our distinguished panel here, panel of experts that will cover the topic about standards to help facilitate compliance with the new regulation. So the first panelist, which is closest on my left, on your right, is Tom Obermeier. He will represent the financial industry at this panel. He joins us from Regulatory Data Corp. On his left is Klaus Ludwig. He is the head of secretariat as the CPMI, so that's the new name for the organizations, which is now Committee for Payments and Market Infrastructures. So he will represent the regulators on the panel. And on his left, we have Stephen Lindsay, which is our head of standards at SWIFT. So he will be the standardizer here on this panel. So if there is one thing today that we can predict for the future, is that the flow of regulation will continue to come our way. Post the financial crisis, the regulators, they have been charged to prevent future crises. So that has been their work. Now, the question that we have is the regulatory objective aligned with the regulatory outcome? That's what our title says, Mind the Regulatory Gap. Now, from a financial industry perspective, from a market participants, you need to comply with those regulations. That's your role. And there's requirements coming from that. And how can that be facilitated? Are standards a solution that will help you comply with those regulations? That's the topic that we want to cover today. So this session will explore how the facilitation through standardization could help you in this compliance job. Now, what we hope is that we can come to some call for action, because this topic has been high on the agenda also of Sibos in general. So we hope that we can come up with some call for action. And we really hope that you will also interact with our panel of experts here. So that's why I mentioned that on these postcards that you have on your chairs, if you can write up a question, we can start to make those interactions with the panelists, and we'll come back to your questions later. So Tom, can you please set the scene for us?
Sure, I guess we'll begin by asking a simple question. How many in the audience think that regulations themselves are a standard? No.
Show of hands?
I think the answer to that question is yes and no. On the one hand, there are regulations that prescribe and dictate certain methodologies that should be done, but largely those methodologies are driven to the point where we try to achieve a common policy outcome. And they need, in order to do that, be very, very general. And that generality leads to a lot of systemic issues for the financial industry as a whole. Yes, there are differing standards, but at its core, I think they're relatively easily harmonized. But it leads to regulations that drive a risk-based approach, which leads each institution to develop different risk tolerances, different operating procedures, different internal policy outcomes themselves, which leads to a system-wide issue of redundancy and a need for better risk mitigation. And so standards from the regulatory side are helpful, and there are components of it that are standards. But the outcome really needs, from a processing side and operational side, a standard to drive a better risk outcome. Klaus?
Thanks. And perhaps to get back to Paul's starting premises, because you mentioned the flow of regulation, which is the usual first feedback I get if I speak to somebody with a regulator's hat. There's too much regulation, and usually the next sentence is, and by the way, it's not detailed enough. So that is, of course, an interesting environment in which we are. I would have been amongst those who would have answered to Tom's question whether regulatory standards are standards. Of course, yes. So there's a certain degree of redundancy from that point of view. But taking up his starting point from a regulator's perspective, there are actually three layers of what can be loosely called standards, and we probably have to get an idea of what we are focusing on. You have the global regulatory requirements, which in itself provide a high-level framework for risk management, but not just risk management. And it's true that much of the recent developments have been driven by this desire to contain systemic risk. But from my own perspective, the Committee of Payment and Market Infrastructures, we have a double objective. It's safety and efficiency. And the efficiency element comes into play certainly when we look at the more granular technical standards, which are the layers underneath. We are seeing in quite a number of the requirements that we've been setting for financial market infrastructures a need to provide additional guidance on elements such as reporting formats, on disclosure forms, details which I would say is an intermediate level. I think we are safe now.
Yeah.
So just getting back to the line of thought, I was mentioning the intermediate level of standards, which is data formats, and of course you have the most granular level, which is the technical IT level, message formats and IT systems. They all interplay, and I guess one of the intriguing aspects is who is actually in charge of developing which of those elements. For the high-level regulatory standards, I think there's no question, but underneath we can probably have a discussion.
Yes, agreed.
Agreed.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. I think we need to define our terms a little bit about standards. I think when we talk about standards from a SWIFT standards point of view, we are talking about that lower level. So absolutely granted, a regulation is a standard. Clearly, it is. It's the same everywhere. It's applied, but and it's created by consensus and so on. So in a certain sense, it's a standard. But I think that when I think about standards as a standardizer, what I'm interested in is the precision of the standard. What I'm interested in is the implementability of the standard. And between those two things, what I want to get is comparable data, comparable outcomes, comparable information. And for me, that's the gap that less and less so, but still remains to be filled. So yes, I certainly take the point that that's not the only definition, but for our working definition, that's what we're talking about. And indeed, there are lots of communities that are out there that develop standards. ISO is one community, there are others. But hitherto, they haven't been as closely involved with the regulatory process as perhaps they might be, with a few notable exceptions.
There's a question as a whole is why doesn't the industry develop its own standard, right? And I think to somebody who's been involved in this for about 15 or 20 years and been one of the founding members of the Wolfsburg Group, the industry's tried in fits and starts to do this, but never used the auspices of SWIFT or the auspices of the Sibos Convention to really, in effect, talk about this. And I think there is a core level here that really needs to be developed, and that is defining elements of standards themselves in the, for lack of a better phrase, the operational bucket that Klaus talks about, that really in the first instance relate to critical information gathering, information structuring, information verification, information integrity, and information upkeep. And I think those are the 5 cornerstones that any standardization would need to achieve here. I think, to Klaus's defense, too often the industry has looked to him, or in his capacity as the face for the world's regulators, sorry Klaus, in this conference, to a large extent, we needed as an industry as a whole to rethink the positioning, to think about what should those standards be, and really get that first bucket designed. And I think if we could figure out what information needs to be gathered, how best to structure that, how best to verify that, keep its upkeeping and preserve its integrity, you'll see better and better risk mitigation going forward. And I think in my conversations with regulators worldwide, it largely has been to the position that they would welcome that approach, because that in turn probably would help some of the regulation develop over the long term.
That's quite true. It's actually, occasionally you feel a bit like in a chicken and egg situation. Would you like first to have highly developed, sophisticated standards and then base your regulation upon it, or would you like to see it the other way around? I'm afraid the uncomfortable truth is it's an ongoing evolution, and the process just doesn't stop.
For sure. Because financial crime itself changes rapidly. And, you know, I often have been very mindful of the difficult position regulators have been in globally, in the sense that, you know, their job is really not, their job is effective regulation. And a cornerstone of that is industry's ability to do its job and to get it right and to be efficient. However, they serve a variety of public policy needs, which oftentimes in a lot of conversations amongst the industry, we tend to forget that, right? I mean, there are huge public policy issues here regarding effective law enforcement, effective protection of the citizenry, preservation of the integrity of the financial system, that oftentimes need to be addressed by regulations, but really don't point or pinpoint efficient processing or efficient operations on that side. And I think, you know, mindful of that as the industry is, and desperate for guidance from regulators, I think the industry as a whole should start taking a more specific approach, defining the processing standards and build a baseline. And I think we'll wind up not only getting greater risk mitigation across the industry, we'll also get more effective and clearer guidance from our regulators.
Right. Yeah. And you're right. The industry clearly has a role to play in making sure that they understand the intention of the regulation and work towards a common implementation.
Yes.
And it's clear that the standards bodies are one way in which they might do that. Absolutely.
I have one question here, which comes into this discussion, that the business process, they have been in place for a while. Mm-hmm. Now the regulation comes after those business processes have been defined. So now it seems that can it still be done to build the regulation in those business processes as a standard so that it satisfies the business process as it was defined, but also it's now new requirement or its new outcome, which is adding the regulation angle to that? What's your views?
I think my view is that the regulatory body as a whole has always been very reactive and not proactive, because that's the nature of regulation, quite honestly. And to some extent, the ability to have flexible processes is a cornerstone of effective operation, but those processes will need to change. But I don't think it starts changing the standardization, right? We're not talking here necessarily about standardized processing, right? I mean, Klaus will be the first to tell you that, you know, under any scenario, core risk management, that's something that can be outsourced through a standardization process or otherwise. Everybody's got to make a risk decision. Everybody's got to follow sound risk management disciplines. But I think here, when we're talking about, in the first instance, the core information to be processed, no matter how the regulatory environment changes, we should have a central core that would relatively stay the same. We may add to it, we may subtract to it, but the formation of that information, the verification process, the structure of that data, I think will make things as a whole better, even in a changing environment.
There's perhaps one additional twist, and that is where, coming from a global regulatory perspective, there is an additional element to be considered. You have, of course, the existing business structures taken for granted, and also, to some degree, pre-existing national standards or national elements to follow. You also have quite frequently a national legal environment to support this or to take care of certain elements. That usually works fine, but if you come then from a global perspective looking at consistency, you face very quickly issues. And perhaps on the good side is to try to develop global standards on the regulatory side, which then need to be filled with life on the technical side. You can act as a lever, because by setting those global standards, you force the national setup, both on the industry side and on the regulatory side, to reconsider and to see whether there's a need to adapt. And I think that is an additional element where the global element may be supportive.
I think that's very true, and I think the key of consistency on the regulatory side, I can appreciate. It's also very difficult, especially in your job, who, to a large extent, is harmonizing everything that the world has to do from the cornerstone of Switzerland. I think, the element there is, by nature, Klaus's job is to represent the sovereign, right? The sovereign needs to decide, of all the intense interests that they have, how best to deploy that from a regulatory framework. And that necessarily means that different sovereigns will approach the problem differently. And that's a legitimate fact. I mean, I think the industry has to embrace that element, that there are certain policy objectives certain countries have with respect to financial crimes that is different. There's a different mindset of the people. There's a cultural history involved. There also is the financial crime vulnerability that each country has, all that drive different regulations. And so when I said at the core, the regulations are easily harmonized. Everybody doesn't want financial crime in the financial marketplace. Everybody wants to prevent money laundering from happening, and everybody wants to prevent fraud from happening. But to a large extent, there are differences which need to be accounted for and addressed to preserve the sovereignty and the integrity of the sovereignty who makes the laws. And I think that's a critical component of it. But none of which I think fundamentally changes the discussion as to whether standardization is a good thing and would it lead, in effect, from Klaus's perspective, better risk mitigation. I think it would. And from our side in the industry, would it lead to more effective processing? I think the answer there is true.
And there are examples. I mean, we can pick on several. But if you take the cross-border high volume payments business, then, for example, FATF recommendation 16 came along and said you have to be able to identify the parties to a payment. From a standardization point of view, we came with the 202 cover message, which enabled that, and that was the global standards community or the SWIFT user community that came together to create that standard. And there's more work going on to further refine those payment standards to make it more effective and more efficient to screen. So, from a regulatory intention, there comes a standardization effort which actually enables the compliance. So it's not unheard of.
So I heard there's potential, there's intention for the regulation to be standardized with some local changes to adapt to the local market requirements. Now, how does that help the industry, which is the market participants that are active in all those different jurisdictions, to comply with those different flavors of the same standard? How can that paradigm be addressed? Any views on that?
I think the largest problem that the industry has with respect to the difference between what the regulations are trying to achieve and the expectations of regulators is at the core of what you're talking about. I think from the industry's perspective, it would be great to have a standardized approach, a standardization, not necessarily of the regulations themselves, but of regulatory expectations. Having been a global risk manager in 140 countries, I can say the difficult part of this is the mindset of the on-the-ground regulator whose job is the active supervision of the financial institutions. Many of them have a different mindset as to how best to achieve what the regulatory objective is and to meet those expectations. And I think that expectation difference would be fundamentally helped massively by a standardized format here, because it will put everybody onto the same message, that this is what is going to be achieved. We agree with the objective, and here is the means by which to achieve it, and get the regulatory expectations in line. And I'm less concerned about the local differences, Paul. I'm more concerned about the expectation mindset of each of the supervisors that goes on, because there is, as everybody in this audience knows, two levels. There is the high level of expectations amongst the supervisors on the regulation passing front. What's the objective? What's the best way to do that? And then there's the enforcement mechanism through examinations, audits, or otherwise that has a different expectation level sometimes than what the regulations are trying to achieve. And I think that will be the singular greatest achievement through the standardization that will help you.
I cannot entirely give you comfort about the degree of standardization of the standardization process. But there's clearly some visible signs. And just to give you a bit of the experience of the developments that I witnessed on the side of the regulatory community. And that is an element which has clearly changed the paradigm. We do no longer just elaborate standards, regulatory requirements, and then dump them at the community.
Right.
the process that is in place now, and I think it is a very important new approach, is that across the standard setting bodies you engage with the addressees, which are not just the industry, it's the national authorities and the industry alike. And we undertake peer reviews, we undertake implementation monitoring, which is not just a grading approach, it is really a two-way process. You look first, how consistent are the measures taken at the level of the authorities, at the level of the industry, and in turn you also have a feedback loop which allows you to provide additional guidance or to modify the standards at the regulatory side to further help achieving the objectives. So it's not exactly what you have in mind, Tom, but it's perhaps a step in the right direction.
I would agree. I think that would go a long way. And I'm just talking from a practitioner, from a practical standpoint. And you know, as we talk about standardization in the industry to help the regulatory flow in the industry itself and for efficiencies, there also will lead, I think, to a process of standardizing on each country's regulatory schemes to, in effect, assure that there is a more consistent mindset as you approach the issues that happen, right? If we all agree this is the standard way we're going to keep data, this is how we're going to verify it, this is how we're going to upkeep it, and there's appropriate regulatory authority over the standardization committee and the standardization process, I think we'll get a great degree of success on both camps.
Are there any other questions now in the audience? Does this provoke some questions in your minds? Is there any question that you would like to ask at this point? In the meantime, I have another question here which you can probably also comment on. Maybe you to start, Stephen. The question here is, can the standards keep up with the mountain of regulation changes that are coming?
I think the answer to that is yes. I see absolutely no reason why they can't. The problem with standardization is always that you don't just need to keep the standard up to date, you need to keep the implementations of those standards up to date. So you need to bring the community of the users of that standard with you. And that typically is the thing that limits the rate at which standards can evolve. So in principle, yes. There are examples where perhaps we haven't seen quite the rapid evolution of the standards that we might have hoped for, but typically that hasn't been because the standards process in itself is too slow. It's because the standards process has to be taken forward by implementers as well.
Any other question at this point? No. I have another question here. Is that it seems like, indeed, you mentioned that the regulatory intent and the regulatory outcome could be solved with some standardization. The industry would have some appetite to participate in that and help in that process, so that both the standards at the regulatory side and those that the industry needs to comply with. What does it take to make that happen? Why has it not happened yet? It seems like there's a kind of an agreement. Now, what does it take?
Well, where do you begin to answer that question? I think you sort of say, from the standpoint, you need an international banking form, if not society, who can speak for most of the major markets, if not all of them. I think you have to have an organization whose integrity is unquestioned, and an organization who has the global processing ability to put that together. I think that would then say, here are the bank's approach. We think these 15 things need to get done in order to build it. And I would build it first from a data gathering, data integrity perspective, then start thinking about how that should be processed. And I think that is the borderline between, are there efficiencies to be gained by having a global organization do some of that processing, or should that be left to each individual firm? That, I think, is the sticky ground here from the industry's perspective. And then beyond that is the fundamental decisioning process. Now, what will happen, generally this is very similar. Just take a page from Silicon Valley for a second, and how Google and Facebook create whole ecosystems, right? The standardization will start to create an ecosystem. That ecosystem will allow not only the regulatory control to become standardized, but the banks themselves to start standardizing the processing. And from there are a whole host of things that start to occur that are good. You can get industry benchmarking, which you won't have before. This is how we would view a risk assessment, almost from a ratings perspective. That benchmark will allow firms to judge their own risk management processes against what a industry-wide benchmark would be on the risk assessment side. Whether that should be done by the global organization or separate and apart from another firm living in that ecosystem, open question. You'll get greater risk mitigation because you'll start to bring those deficient organizations globally up to a nice high global standard, which they can't do now largely for cost reasons. But if you create standardization and start to create a degree of reliance on that information, you will start getting the non-performers to a higher degree of performance than they currently have right now. And you have the ability also really to drive a whole amount of efficient processes that will get a higher objective achieved than currently right now. But the starting point, again, is you have to get the core information gathered, assessed, and structured and verified. Otherwise, in my mind, everything flows from that.
And I think that, we say, why isn't it happening? I think that we can point to examples where it has happened. I think the LEI is an excellent example of that. That is a public-private partnership. We have had both regulators and regulated involved in the creation of that. It's a structurally quite simple standard, granted, but from an operational point of view, it's a very complex thing to deal with. And yet, the industry together seems to be capable of pulling that off. So we have examples. We can go further. I think we should try to build on that. Agreed.
That's actually a very noticeable development, and from what in the past used to be the pinnacle of interaction, that as a regulator you have public consultations, everybody is forced within a short delay to write lengthy responses to a huge number of questions. The LEI is one of those examples which I think show also here a shift on the interaction, because it tries to bring together the advantages that you can bring in from a regulatory perspective and the industry perspective. What I find interesting in the interaction that you see, for example, in the LEI project, is the staged approach, that you, as a regulator, first try to define high-level concepts of what you would expect in a certain field. Then, and again, that is something where the public sector has probably an added value contribution to make, is to structure the governance process, to make sure that the processes for the actual standardization are set up in an accountable, transparent way. But then bring in the industry for the actual implementation. And I think if you have this staged approach, that in itself is really providing a novelty to what was done in the past.
I think that's an excellent idea.
So that's a good example here. We have a question over there.
Indeed, yeah. Thank you very much, Paul. And the question is really about how we as a standards how we as a standards community get the legislators, the regulators, the lawyers to engage with us to figure out semantic definitions at a low enough, at a detailed enough level to count, so that regulatory compliance itself can be standardized.
I'm going to turn it on its end, right? I think we began the premise a little bit by Klaus, poignantly saying, he at once gets criticized for too much regulation and not enough detail. So I think from some standpoint, most regulators, in my experience, would allow the industry to pinpoint and create a benchmark of what wants to be achieved. Getting through the staging process that Klaus says, okay, let's take that from a regulatory perspective, vet that, does that make sense, what is the achievement going to happen? I don't think, with 25 years in banking, I ever want my regulators anywhere in the world to be in the weeds, right? I really do not want that to happen. And I would really encourage the industry as a whole to sort of take the granular step, put that out there, and let the process begin from there. Because there are elements, Klaus has a very large magic wand, but even that magic wand can't cure all the ills there are in society.
But as to what you mentioned, what are the incentives to bring in the interest on the public authorities side? On a very personal remark, I think the best incentive is frustration on the side of the authorities. Frustration that the setup just doesn't deliver what is expected. So I think there are tools. Frustration is not the only one, but it's probably a very helpful one.
Yes, agreed. I agree. And I think the frustration there is, as a whole, the regulatory environment and the industry have been completely reactive to this, right? It's interesting that I just come back from Silicon Valley, this week, where, the next generation of payment firms that are being done in the Valley, the Facebook payments, the Google payments, the Alipays, they're looking at compliance as a competitive advantage, right? They're trying to achieve, a societal good, and yes, they're trying to get ahead of the regulatory arms that are coming to them. But even before that happens, central to the processing elements that they're doing is a core compliance element. And they're going beyond, traditional know your customer, and they're creating standards of trust diligence, which brings, reputation capital into play with, good old-fashioned diligence on our side. And they're creating some really interesting stuff. And I think the industry here as a whole has always been very held back and reactive, and have never taken the mindset of putting compliance first as a competitive advantage. And, in the wake of $150 billion in fines in the United States alone, one would think the regulatory measure, subtly or otherwise, has been compliance really needs to be a competitive advantage. And I think if we can start focusing on the details and building that sort of stuff in, it makes Klaus's job a heck of a lot easier. And it makes the bank's job of meeting those regulatory expectations a lot cleaner.
Here another question, which is probably giving a different spin on the discussion now. Technology. Is technology there to help? Can technology help, or is it already there? What do you think about these aspects in helping the standards to be constructed and to be used? Can that be an enabler, or is there more work to be done on that front?
I think as a whole, the current state of technology is more than advanced enough to solve the issue of standardization and delivery of the standardization and the processing of the standardization. I think, we got to talk about formats, we got to talk about the data structure, we got to talk about how best to preserve that integrity, all core elements that everybody in this room and in this conference hall has worked their entire career on preserving in contexts outside of the regulatory compliance area. I think as a whole, in this age of big data, which leads to so much data obesity at times, I think that field has an ability to bring a lot of dynamic dimensions to the standard, to feeding the standard process, automatic updating, supplemented by transactional data. A lot of that can really lead to a lot of interesting standardizations on the technology side. I think that enabling's there. I think a SaaS-like framework, whether we consider Swift even in retrospect a sort of SaaS-driven private cloud that it is, I think that sort of format allows a utilization of the delivery mechanism, a sharing of the delivery mechanism that otherwise wouldn't be there. I think that technology exists now, all of which will lead to not only the standardization itself and a strong standardization process, but also efficient means of delivering that standard to the industry.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. We had a very interesting presentation here yesterday from a professor at MIT, Andrei Krylenko. Yes. And he has been talking for a while now about the notion of being able to define regulation in a formalized way with formal semantics and formal processes in a way that makes it much more consumable for the people who have to implement regulation, which ultimately is a bunch of programmers, not lawyers. And we had a conversation about it right here on the standard, which was very, very interesting. And the conclusion was that yes, the technology does exist. We don't have to. It's not science fiction. The difficulties are more organizational and political to make that happen. Now, I'm not sure that I think that the conclusions that we came to yesterday might have been a tad over optimistic, honestly. But nevertheless, the notion that we can bring some some formalization of the type that we already bring to formalizing business processes for automation purposes to regulation doesn't seem to me to be too far-fetched.
And I tend to think, speaking personally, engineers make fine attorneys. And I think that process is very similar in the thought disciplines.
Yeah.
So I think there's a way to meld that together. Unfortunately, the public policy perspective of regulation really prohibits the granular assertion that needs to happen at times.
Right.
And so that sort of clarity that an engineer will love, I don't know if we're ever
Yeah.
going to get there.
Yeah, indeed,
But I
finding
agree.
the right point of handoff
Yes.
from the people who are concerned with policy to the people who are concerned with implementation, and making sure that happens in a way that nothing gets lost, I think, is the difficulty.
Perhaps just one aspect here, and that is I have a lot of sympathy for trying to go in that direction. But as you mentioned, Tom, that ultimately at the level of the industry, there is a level of judgment when it comes to risk management. There is also a remaining degree of judgment and discretion when it comes to setting standards on the regulatory side, which you cannot entirely do away with. So just a small word of caution here.
I agree. And I think from the standardization side, as I said before, there is a, and I would think the best way to think about it is from the processing side, right? I mean, if you're in a situation, what is right for standards? We all have a common purpose. We want the integrity of the financial system to be preserved. We have a systemic concern here, right? We have an issue of how best to do it right. We have a systemic issue of redundancy. We also have to do this, right? Each individual itself. And when I mean the redundancy side, I don't mean the core risk management decisioning process, but I do mean the process gathering, the data gathering, the assessment of that data, which we all do separate and apart, which doesn't lead to a single point of failure as somebody's raised, but does lead to 80,000 different points of vulnerability, which isn't healthy either. And I think all of that combined through a standardization will lead to a more effective risk mitigation across the system.
Okay, so what I hear is that it's quite positive. You're positive that solution can be brought.
Yes.
Now that brings something to my mind. And Stephen, you mentioned about the positive example and the rich experience of the LEI, and I think you all confirmed that is really a good example. I think there's other examples where it did not work so well. If we look at, for example, the new trade repository requirements, where we've seen differences in the way where it has been implemented in the US, where it's been implemented in Europe, although ultimately the requirements are the same. It's get data to be able to analyze first, and secondly, to reduce systemic risk, and even better, resolve when there would be a problem. But there we've seen that the results were not there, so the gap is still there. There's different requirements, and each local flavor brings it different. Why did it happen well in one domain and less good in the other?
I think I have to take up this one, and perhaps to give it a slightly more positive spin, because what is overlooked is actually the quite considerable progress that was made in establishing the infrastructures for trade repository first. That was something which was started from scratch, and of course, if you take this into account, there is something visible and tangible in place. For the substance, that is the comparable and the consistency of data, and in particular the possibility to aggregate across jurisdictions, there is an issue that's undeniable, and that is to some degree a consequence of what I mentioned before about the staging of processes. We did not have the possibility to start with an entirely clean sheet here. You had some national structures, some, in a sense of urgency, wanted to move as quickly as possible before global standards were finalized. You also have, of course, again, the legal setting. I think one of the biggest issues here is less on the data structure, but on some legal impediments to bring together the elements that you would need to have a global picture. And these issues need to be addressed in a coherent and comprehensive manner. What is happening is there is quite some effort on the regulatory community now to pick this up. And it's actually taken quite a bit of resources on the side of both the Financial Stability Board, but also my colleagues NIOSCO and the CPMI to first identify the barriers and to provide the necessary pressure for the authorities concerned to consider change. And it's not always the regulatory community, it's the legislator or ministries of justice who may have quite conflicting perspectives on these issues. So it's not an easy deal. And on the more data element side, we have embarked now following the September FSB meeting, G20 meeting, on a quite complex exercise to provide further guidance on data harmonization. And I think, again, if you look at it in a process manner, this will move further forward into a direction where we are indeed having a better ability to aggregate and consolidate data.
I agree, and I don't want to, in any way diminish the work that needs to happen going forward. However, we are sitting in a convention run by SWIFT, which, in all honesty, seemingly solved a larger problem of what is the standard for global commerce worldwide. And I think that probably was just a tad more enormous than what we're going to tackle here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we know that the FSB have got this problem in their sights. That's great to know. I think that it is a consequence of the rush to get infrastructure in place in the wake of the crisis. And as you said at the beginning, this is an iterative process. We get it wrong, we try again, we get it right. And I think that was what will happen in this case as well.
But let's get started. Right?
So I hear also good news then coming our way. So I think we can be all positive there. I think what I heard was also that the calendars may be sometimes an issue in making the things aligned. There's different calendars. People are on different routes, and that needs to be maybe harmonized as well there.
Right.
And that's then maybe, if I heard you well, Klaus, that's maybe something for the lawmakers and the legislators to also participate in this whole discussion. So I think we've heard now some good news that it looks like the standards will be able to help us. It looks like there's will to go in that direction, that there is space for harmonization. In coming maybe to a kind of conclusion for this, and what do we need to do to make it happen? What's the call for action here? How can we make sure that after this session, this does not just fade away and that we are stuck with the same problems and we are here next year, well, not here, but somewhere else, talking about the same things again? What needs to happen between now and next year? What's your views?
So from the industry perspective, I would say there are 7,000 priority steps that need to be accomplished.
Yes.
First is there is underway a lot of talk from a variety of agencies now to create that single standards, particularly as it sets to data, and to actually start acquiring that data and putting it into a structure. So that's a good positive step. I can remember speaking to SWIFT in 2002 about the need to sort of take the charge there. And I'm happy to say in 2013 they started that, and I think that's very good. It's a natural organization, it's a natural fit in question integrity, data security, great model on a sharing or rentable space, and I think that's a good outcome. I think there then has to be user acceptance of that standards, and that's sort of the industry perspective. Until we get that right, it's a little unfair to talk to Klaus as the representative of global regulators, to sort of say we need further clarity there. And I think regulators as a whole will appreciate that thought leadership. Whether we get it right or not, there'll be some toing and froing. But really, before Klaus can begin his step, the industry as a whole needs to present that standard out there, because that will make his life and his vetting process a heck of a lot easier.
I cannot deny this. Actually, I'm happy that you make that point. Perhaps on the positive note, first, there is a bit of expectation management. I do appreciate 1 year from now looks like a very long period, and we want to achieve everything by tomorrow. But if anything has taught me in the LEI experience, good standardization needs a considerable degree of time, and extrapolating from this what we are now embarking on with the uniform product and transaction identifiers, I would think 12 months is actually a quite short time horizon in this game. However, and that is now really to pick up on your question, what is expected, I think the processes are there to really allow an active feedback loop from the industry into the regulatory processes. And what I mentioned before about trying to have appropriate governance for those processes, we are working on this. There's still room for improvement, but it is really critically dependent on the industry feeding in and contributing and making sure that the diversity of views is being represented, not just a small subset, which in the past occasionally was noticeable. So there's really a plea here for everybody out from the industry to actively participate.
And from a standards point of view, Stephen, how do you see that?
Yeah, I agree with the industry needs to keep involved, remain involved, build on the momentum that we've started with the LEI, build on the call to action we have through the FSB on the trade repository side as well, and just continue to build that momentum. I think that there are plenty of positive signs that we need to talk about, communicate on, and make sure that everybody is on board with, and that we can build that momentum further.
And I don't ever see it going away, quite honestly. I mean, it'll be a healthier dialogue as it evolves, but constant reassessment of what we're doing and the efficacy of our actions is core to a continuous improvement process that really needs to be, as core of the standardization issue.
So what I heard means it needs your engagement. So it's not only to come and listen, you need also to engage with the industry representatives and make sure that your voice is heard. I think that's one point that was made. I think also what we heard is that it will take some time. We need to manage expectations right. This is not going to happen overnight, so we'll probably still talk about it next year, but maybe no longer start from scratch, but we will have set one step forward. That's what I hear. So I think that's good news. We just need you now to engage and to continue the discussion. So I'd like to thank the three panelists for this very insightful information. I think it was a very interesting topic and very well elaborated. I think we helped shape the conversation as part of the Swift motto, so thank you.